In a previous speech I gave a view of the economics of trans oppression, specifically how job discrimination, housing discrimination, and social violence combined to form a cycle of poverty, which formed the foundation of trans oppression, and contrasted this with the state of transgender people in socialist Cuba. And this time I'd like to talk more about the political context of the trans struggle throughout its history. So, without further ado, in 1969, the catalyzing of the LGBT movement around the Stonewall Rebellion had made drag queens, trans women, and the gender nonconformity of the gay community visible worldwide for the first time. They were primarily seen by bourgeois reactionary forces at the time as a threat to gender norms, to the nuclear family, and ultimately to the stability of capitalist society. These perceptions were in one way correct. Trans and gender nonconforming people today embody a contradiction between the sex we were assigned at birth and ourselves. Bourgeois ideology tells us that assigned sex is a simple biological fact, immutable and eternal. The absolution of the gender binary forms the basis of the gender division of labor, which attempts to divide the entire human race into producers and reproducers. This division lies at the heart of class society and is embodied within the capitalist nuclear family. This simplistic system, however, contradicts actual biology. Soviet medical scientists as early as the 1920s had remarked that human sexual difference was not binary but infinite. This has been evidenced by the worldwide prevalence of multigendered societies throughout pre-colonial history. Through our existence, trans people prove this entrenched system of gender fallible. By demonstrating that there is no inherent difference between people of different genders, transness can be used as an ideological weapon against capitalism and cut towards a more complete and accurate understanding of gendered oppression. Back to history, however. At the time, the bourgeois state had its own recourse to the new trans visibility: medical stigmatization and criminalization. By labeling homosexuality and gender dysphoria, the latter of which still stands, as disorders for diagnosis, gay and trans people were socially otherized, given another hurdle between them and social acceptance, and explained away the difference between the queer and the ordinary as inherent differences in the form of disorders to be treated. At the same time, laws against impersonating women were enforced by the police, giving the state free rein to arrest trans women, an attempt not to protect any particular individual or even private property, but the ideology of assigned sex within the minds of the people. These were the formal grounds of our exclusion from society, and could be described as attempts at the confinement of trans people and the growth of our communities via the avenues of bourgeois medicine and law. It was obvious that trans people were being treated as a threat, but the nature of the threat we posed was more difficult for even us to discern. The trans movement struggled for recognition in order to stay alive and in order to achieve social change. But it was in many ways limited by its lack of historical context. Trans people could understand their own oppression perfectly well, but for many decades there was no theory or history explaining the place of their struggle in history or in the present world, nor its significance to understanding and combating gendered oppression as a whole. Regardless, trans people sought to organize around their shared oppression and unite with the movements in which we belonged. Overwhelmingly, trans women could find no respite in the women's movements at the time. Most ideological currents within the radical feminist movement were dominated by theory which essentialized the root of women's oppression to biology, taking the supposedly universal genetic differences between two sexes as their starting point, instead of social relations, which they claimed followed. This view, as Marxism makes clear, itself reinforces the institution of the gender binary, legitimizing the same fundamentally patriarchal ideology it claims to oppose. Radical feminists also actively waged a cultural war against the transgender community and its activists, publishing works on how the practice of trans women transitioning actually appropriated womanhood, reinforced gender roles, and divided the women's movement against itself. Meanwhile, the liberal feminist movement found itself unequipped and unwilling to deal with any such controversial issues that would obstruct its goal of equality via the further integration of women into capitalist production and into the bourgeois state. So, as a result of these exclusions, it was largely up to trans women to fight their own battles against the laws criminalizing them, against the police brutalizing them, against the culture vilifying them, and against the men murdering them. Finally, in the 1990s, the trans community received the theoretical leap it needed in the work of our late comrade Leslie Feinberg, who wrote extensively, thank you, on gender and gender nonconformity throughout world history, from the perspective of historical materialism. Her work explained how matriarchy, homosexuality, and gender nonconformity were challenged and dominated by patriarchy at the advent of class society, how trans oppression was hoisted onto the world by European colonizers, and how the trans struggle was advancing in present-day socialist Cuba, which of course continues to this day. At the same time as this Marxist view on trans liberation was being made concrete, a tendency within the liberal feminist movement which sought to appear inclusive of racialized people, LGBT people, and disabled people in order to win over young progressive women was beginning to grow. This trend has also continued to the present. It has become widely accepted that black women, brown women, lesbians, trans women, and disabled women should be made a part of this contemporary movement, but their inclusion is superficial to a tendency with its own interests in mind. The women whose primary political interest is putting a fellow white woman in the White House have little to offer multiply oppressed women whose needs are far greater and weigh far heavier. This process occurred concurrently and not coincidentally with another such shift within the Democratic Party itself and its platform aimed at increasingly disenfranchised progressive youth. It is the Democrats who are also responsible for a noticeable push from the state as a whole to achieve a similar visage of inclusiveness, starting in the 2000s with cisgender LGBT people and more recently with trans people. This has resulted in the very state which once arrested trans women for walking the streets of Manhattan, employing trans people as public servants and even as soldiers. This dichotomy perfectly illustrates the choice available to trans people in the US at present: assimilation or liberation. The prospect of assimilation into a white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist society is admittedly appealing to some trans people, just as it was to LGBT people and to cishet women before. But to the trans community, which is still struggling, racialized, and nonconforming, who are still bound to the same cycle of poverty that the warriors at Stonewall were, who still rely upon sex work, who still find themselves homeless, and to anyone who sincerely represents their interests, it will not do. It remains that the only path forward is one of a deep understanding of the trans struggle as essential, not incidental, to the struggle against gender oppression. It is one which necessitates solidarity with the gains of women and trans people in socialist Cuba against imperialism. And it is one of militant dedication to our shared liberation. This is the only path which promises us anything of hope. To conclude, trans people must wield gender as an ideological weapon against patriarchy and thereby against white supremacy, imperialism, and capitalism. If they do not, they will wield it first and foremost against their own kind. Furthermore, any organized movement which seeks to represent the trans struggle must recognize and understand our unique and essential position in the struggle against gender oppression and not essentialize, delegitimize, or tokenize trans and gender nonconforming people. This is the movement we must continue to build here and stand in solidarity with all around the world. This is why we say Stonewall means fight back.
That's right.